Okay, we've completed loading 10 rounds of our .308 Winchester, and it's now time to check our loads and take them to the range and test them. There's a certain procedure that I always follow in a certain order in which I do it. The first one is to simply inspect the cartridges that are completed, make sure that they look correct to the naked eye. We've pretty much confirmed each step of the quality control on our way through it. As you know from the other videos, there are blocks such as this Lyman tool here. This is the handgun block where you put the finished cartridges in it and check for fit in the chamber. I don't happen to have one for rifles, but the easiest way to do that is to cycle a couple of them through the firearm. They should go into battery without any extreme force, and they should eject properly even before they're fired. We're assuming, since you're watching these videos and you're probably new to reloading, we're assuming that you do have experience with the firearm in question and the caliber in question. For instance, if you're doing the .308 Winchester, we're operating on the assumption that you own a .308 Winchester and that you've shot it regularly with commercial ammunition and you're now advancing to reloading. If that's not the case, then I would strongly suggest you actually start with commercial ammunition. The reason for it is very simple. One of the variables you want to eliminate is the functioning of the firearm itself, and the best way to do that is to use commercial ammunition in it. If it goes into battery, if it fires properly, if it's reasonably accurate, if it ejects properly, if you're comfortable with the noise level and the recoil, then it's pretty safe to assume that the firearm you're going to use with your reloads is in good working order. That is important. You do want to eliminate that as the first obvious variable. You want to cycle a couple of these rounds through it to make sure they fit properly and eject properly. The other reason why you want to have some experience with the firearm in the caliber is because you want to know intuitively what you anticipate in the way of recoil and noise level, because these are the first two things you're going to experience when you take your first reloads to the range to test them. The procedure I always follow is to load one round and fire it at the target. The reason for that is it is a brand new reload for me. It's a new formula, a new combination. I want to know how it performs, and there's a number of things that I want to test. One of them is the amount of recoil. It should be the same or less than I normally experience with commercial ammo, because these have been loaded to a minimum spec to get started. The noise level should be roughly the same, although that's going to be one of the more difficult things to tell, especially if you're wearing ear protection. There's a third thing you want to experience, though. You want to shoot reloads over a chronograph. I strongly recommend that all reloaders own a chronograph and use it always, at least with the first rounds of a load that's new to you. Very simply, this is your very best safety check to compare the velocity you're experiencing with the velocity that's anticipated in the manuals. If you're close, that's a very good assurance that your pressures are going to be close to the pressures that are experienced in the manuals for the test loads, and that this particular combination of ingredients you have assembled with reasonable accuracy. If you are significantly off in any of the variables, chances are you're going to see it in the velocity. But the velocity is the only indirect way you're going to be able to check pressure. So it's extremely important that you know that your load is reasonable. Now, there's one last thing that I check besides velocity, recoil, noise level when I fire my first round. Is there a hole in the target? Now, that sounds kind of simplistic, but the reality is if there isn't a hole in the target, that can only be the result of one of two things. One of them would be that you missed the target, which is the obvious one. The second issue, though, could be that you had a squib load. Now, the way the manuals are developed and the test rounds are developed for the data in the manuals, it should be near impossible to get a squib load if you are accurately reloading to the minimum published standards in commercial quality reloading manuals. It's possible you did something wrong, though. If you're new to reloading and you're new to all of these steps, especially the measuring of powder, if for any reason you were on the underside, you want to simply rule it out if there's no hole in the target. Chances are there's going to be a hole in the target. I wouldn't start practicing with brand new reloads anyway at extreme distances where there was a fair likelihood of missing the target. So there should be a hole in the target. If there's not, always check with your range officer. You don't want to be disassembling firearms or looking down the barrels of firearms unless it's a bolt action. You can remove the bolt and look through it from the rear. You don't want to be doing any of that sort of thing with a firearm at the range without the knowledge and consent of the range officer, him or herself. Lastly, let's assume we fired our first round, the noise level, recoil, velocity were all what we expected, we're happy with it. The very next thing I do is to completely load the firearm so that the magazine is full and there's a round in the chamber. I then fire one more round, and again, obviously being tuned into velocity and noise and recoil and hole in the target, but then I take the other rounds out of the magazine. I would have brought my caliper to the range with me, and I check the COL length of all of the remaining rounds that were in the firearm when a round was fired. And that's because the force of the recoil is the only thing that would cause bullet creep, and you want to see that there was none. If there is none, then you're starting to be able to prove that your light crimp that we put on these rounds was sufficient. Put those rounds back in the firearm chamber and fire the next one. Again, measure the loads. Continue to do this until you're down to the last cartridge. If the last cartridge experiences no bullet creep and it has been through the recoil of all of the other rounds in the cartridge, then that's proof positive that your crimp was sufficient. You don't want more crimp than is necessary, but you also don't want less. And the real proof of that pudding is that you did not get any bullet creep in that last round that went through all of the recoils from the previous rounds. So with that, we're going to complete our last video here on the 308 series. We hope that you've enjoyed this and learned something from it. Best wishes, always reload safely and be safe with your firearms.